The Imperial Army, known formerly in High Gothic as the Exertus Imperialis and the Imperialis Auxilia, respectively, the hosts of the Imperial Army and its auxiliaries, was the ancient imperial military force comprised of normal men and women that served as the direct ancestor of the Astra Militarum of the 41st millennium. Unlike the Astra Militarum and the Navis Imperialis of the present day, the Imperial Army of the 30th and early 31st millennia contained ground, air, and space assets all within the same table of organization, and there was no differentiation between space-based and ground-based branches of the service. The origins of the Astra Militarum date back to the time of the Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium, when the Emperor of Mankind conquered a large swath of the galaxy and forged the Imperium of Man. As the Great Crusade progressed, and more worlds needed to be liberated, the Imperium's need for more troops increased dramatically. Even the mighty transhuman armies of the Legiones Astartes could not alone complete the task at hand. It was therefore decreed that each of the liberated worlds would supply men-at-arms to bolster the war effort. Although not as powerful as the Space Marine legions under the various Primarchs' command, the Imperial Army regiments were nevertheless useful additions to the Astartes' fighting strength. Unlike in the present-day Imperium, where the Imperial Guard serves as mankind's frontline armed force in the defense of the Emperor's realm, the Imperial Army was never anything more than a reserve force for the Imperium during the Great Crusade, and its troops were usually tasked with garrison duty or mopping up operations. Only in the last decades of that great campaign did Imperial Army troops finally fight directly alongside the forces of one of the ancient Space Marine legions on campaign. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium, a great reform of the Imperium's bureaucratic and military structure was undertaken at the behest of the Primarch Robut Guilliman, who had become the first Lord Commander of the Imperium. To prevent the possibility of a large-scale interstellar rebellion from consuming the human-settled galaxy again, the titanic armies of the Imperium were divided into three basic parts. These included the Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, a ground-based force of mortal soldiers that would replace the fractured Space Marine legions as the Imperium's frontline troops, and a space-based service containing all of the Imperium's naval assets that was responsible for all space-related transport and combat duties. This reform led to the formation of the present-day Astra Militarum and Imperial Navy. During the turbulent era known as the Age of Strife, the Sol system and the nearby star systems that had been colonized by humanity during the Age of Technology were effectively cut off from interstellar travel or communication with each other due to the massive warp storms that swept the galaxy. Little remained of the once sophisticated civilization of old Earth's glorious past as the center of a growing human interstellar society marked by advanced science, high culture, and wondrous technologies. Techno-barbarian warlords and their warrior hordes continuously fought over the planet, which had become little more than a massive battleground for their wars of attrition. They made use of chemical, biological, and even thermonuclear weapons of mass destruction, and slowly transformed the cradle of mankind into a battered post-apocalyptic wasteland across most of its scarred surface. It was against this backdrop of oppression, violence, and casual brutality that the Emperor of Mankind first revealed himself to the people of Terra. In secret, he had been planning for this moment in history for millennia, ever since the Age of Strife had fractured what remained of the ancient human civilization which had once stretched across a part of the galaxy. The Emperor moved to create the military organizations he would need to begin the reunification of mankind, and he used the raw materials at hand after millennia of savage conflict between the techno-barbarian nation-states of old Earth. Formed during the savage continental wars that had engulfed Terra in the Age of Strife, the genetically enhanced warriors known as Genos comprised the first units of the force that would become the Imperial Army and would serve as the prototypes for the later development of the Proto-Space Marines called the Thunder Warriors. Among the most well-known of the regiments composed of Genos were the so-called Strife Epic regiments raised by the Emperor to initiate the unification wars intended to reunite all the warring peoples of Terra beneath his benevolent rule. The The genetically enhanced Strife Epic regiments came to form the nucleus of the armed forces that would later support the even more genetically advanced Space Marine legions during their reconquest of the human-settled galaxy. The Emperor began his conquest of Terra with the intent to reunite the warring techno-barbarian nations into a unified planetary government, and then use Terra as the springboard from which to begin his reconquest of the galaxy under the aegis of an Imperium of Man dedicated to the imperial truth of progress and reason. The Genos proved throughout the conflict to reunite Terra that became known as the Unification Wars to be a most effective and adaptable military force. During this time, the Genos practiced gene mustering, an essential tool during those caustic years of atomic hurricanes and drifting rad clouds. Through the use of genetic manipulation, the Genos were able to develop tough and physically imposing warriors, but they complemented their brute strength and resilience by importing smart, proven field commanders from other forces that kept their genetic pool pure. The genetically enhanced regiments of this period, such as the lauded Geno 52 Chiliad, would go on to become amongst some of the oldest brigades to serve in the later Imperial Army. Each Geno of the Imperial Army, in addition to referring to the individual genetically enhanced soldiers, also was a term applied to an elite force of the Imperial Army that was composed of 1,000 companies, with each maintaining a proud martial tradition. These surviving Genos were proud members of the Old Hundred, the Strife Epic regiments that the Emperor, in his grace, had maintained in existence after the completion of the unification, provided that they had pledged their loyalty to him. Many thousands of other Geno units had been forced to disband after the achievement of unity, or had been actively purged and chemically neutered, depending on their level of resistance to the new order brought by the unification of Terra under the Emperor's new planetary government. When the great warp storms that had cut off Terra since the end of the Dark Age of technology subsided, and the Age of Strife came to an end in the late 30th millennium, the Emperor of Mankind deemed it time to begin his Great Crusade. This was a massive campaign begun in CK 800. M30, to conquer the galaxy, by which he and his armies would free all human-settled colony worlds from alien oppression or primitive ignorance, and reunite the human species across the galaxy under the single banner of the new Imperium of Man. The Great Crusade marked a brief era in human history of rebuilding, reunification, and rapid technological advancement following the complete regression of mankind into techno-barbarism during the 5,000 Terran years of the Age of Strife. The Emperor sought to unite all of humanity under one banner following the long night of the Age of Strife and end interhuman conflict. Once united, the Emperor intended to begin the next stage of his great plan to ensure human domination of the Milky Way galaxy. At the forefront of this time of expansion and reclamation were the mighty Space Marine legions, the Legiones Astartes, the finest warriors humanity had ever created, each the equal of a dozen normal men. Despite their formidable battle prowess, the forces of the Space Marines were not limitless, and the relentless demands of building a galactic empire pushed the legions further apart. Separated by countless thousands of light years, their presence became ever more scattered and diluted. No doubt from the very beginning, the Emperor realized that while his Legiones Astartes would be his foremost agents of war and conquest, the sheer scope of the undertaking of the Great Crusade, no less than the liberation of the entire galaxy, would require far more manpower spread over a wider area than even hundreds of thousands of Space Marines could hope to achieve. They simply could not be everywhere at once, nor would they be best served by undertaking roles ably filled by ordinary humanity. From this reality, the Exertus Imperialis was born. Billions of second-line and support troops, functionaries, laborers, void crew, logisticians, almoners, adepts, and staff officers, and the countless quantities of weapons, equipment, and war machines, void conveyances, and warships they needed, all to make the Great Crusade a reality. Within this vast body of men and women under arms, organized and formulated by the Emperor's own transhuman intelligence, were many highly specialized divisions, each created to serve a singular purpose, each a vital cog in the vast imperial war machine. The Emperor required more manpower to ensure the momentum of the Great Crusade did not falter. Each newly conquered or liberated world brought into imperial compliance during the course of the imperial campaign was assessed and a census taken of its population. From this, the Emperor's administrators of the Corps Logisticae, the forerunner of the later Departamento Munitorum, calculated the tithe that each world was to pay in the form of regiments of soldiers and war materiel. The numbers of regiments raised from each world varied enormously in accordance with the size of each individual planet's population. Sparsely populated worlds would be tithed to supply only a handful of regiments annually, whilst the overcrowded hive worlds near to the galactic core would have to supply hundreds of regiments every standard year. This huge body of soldiers soon became known as the Imperialis Auxilia, or more commonly referred to as the Imperial Army. Although the Imperial Army was not as powerful as the Space Marine legions under the Primarch's command, the Imperial Army regiments were nevertheless useful additions to a Primarch's fighting strength. A Space Marine legion often had hundreds of auxiliary Imperial Army regiments fighting under its command. These troops were used to reinforce the Space Marines and were frequently deployed in sieges, mass invasions, and to garrison newly conquered worlds. The Imperial Army was rarely deployed within the home system of the regiments that comprised it. In fact, this was actively avoided by the Primarchs in command of these regiments to ensure that the soldiers' loyalties lay first and foremost with the individual Primarch and the Space Marine Legion to which they had been attached and alongside which they fought. The Exertus Imperialis of the Great Crusade era was a vast organization whose numbers in a literal sense are uncounted. No accurate measure of it was ever possible, so numerous was it, widespread across the stars and in flux as units were disbanded or suffered attrition, and fresh units, recruits, and indentures were added to its ranks. As a structure, it is almost unfathomably complex. It formed the incomprehensibly vast support structure of the Great Crusade, including in its sweep the Expeditionary Fleet's front-line auxiliary and second-line reserve forces, known collectively under the subtitle of the Imperialis Auxilia, or Imperial Army informally, and the billions of planetary militia-raised provincial defense. It also included the myriad support organizations, colossal labor hosts, penitentiary legions, the warships and crew of the Imperialis Armada, the vast exactory, notary and tithe corps, and nominally the remembrancers, the iterators, and the enforcers of the imperial truth. All were bound by its writ. Although notionally it was to the Officio Militaris on Terra, and via them the imperial court to whom the numberless ranks of the Exertus Imperialis answered, it was always in truth subordinate to the principal agents and independent powers of the Great Crusade who commanded it on a daily basis. The Legiones Astartes and their Primarchs, the Mechanicum and their Titan legions, the Night Houses, the rogue traders militant, the imperial commanders who governed the Imperium's worlds, the Nivis Nobilitae and the Collegia Sicana, all had better and more immediate call on the Exertus Imperialis to obey. So it was when the Imperium was riven by the Horus heresy, so also was the Exertus Imperialis, turning traitor or remaining loyal with long accustomed masters to lead them, while even its more independent arms were forced abruptly to choose sides in a war not of their making. As the Great Crusade died, so did the organization that served it, supplied it, and fed its growth come to an end, split by division and torn in blood. During the Great Crusade, it was common practice to subordinate Imperial Army regiments to the Imperial Expeditionary Fleets controlled by the Space Marine legions. But after the corruption by the Chaos Gods of the Emperor's most favored son and Imperial War Master, the Primarch Horus, and the onset of the Horus heresy in the early 31st millennium, it soon became apparent what a monumental mistake it had been to place Imperial Army units under the control of the Space Marine legions. During that time of civil war, the Imperium was split asunder, and humanity turned in upon itself in a bloody war which almost saw its complete destruction. The War Master led fully half of the legendary Space Marine legions in open revolt against the Imperium which had created them and the Master which they were sworn to protect. Alongside these legions of genetically engineered warriors marched millions of Imperial soldiers, men and women drawn from across the colonies of mankind and gathered under the banner of the Emperor. When Horus turned against his father, he took countless soldiers and ships of the Imperial Army with him. Those men which had once fought for humanity during the Emperor's Great Crusade to reunite the human-settled galaxy under the Imperial banner were instead pitted against each other in a bloody struggle as the heresy unfolded and civil war spanned the galaxy. Amongst the traitor legions, almost all of their attached Imperial Army formations uniformly followed their masters into rebellion out of fear or blind faith. Even amongst the Loyalists, Imperial Army units with an officer cadre of genetically enhanced Geno warriors performed poorly, usually driven to destruction by the inability of the unaugmented human soldiers to keep up with the demands of their transhuman Space Marine leaders. Over the course of the heresy, entire armies of mortals were raised and squandered, both by the traitors and the desperate Loyalist commanders. Across the breadth and width of the galaxy, the Imperial Army tore itself apart in monumental battles on a scale unseen in human history. Combined forces of fleet and army elements moved from world to world at the command of generals and lord commanders whose loyalties were unknown to both sides. Thousands of pocket empires were carved out by ambitious commanders with no true loyalty to either side. Over the course of the following centuries, and at a cost of billions of lives, the Imperium was slowly reforged, forever tainted by the blood spilt in the massive civil war which had almost destroyed it. After Horus was defeated and his armies had taken flight from Terra into the Eye of Terror, the Imperium was in chaos, weakened and shattered after long years of war. Even though the need for the Imperial Army was as great as ever, those loyalist leaders that remained, led by the Ultramarines Legion's Primarch Robut Guilliman, were fearful of a repeat of the rebellion which had cost them so dearly. In the aftermath of the Horus heresy, massive changes were implemented to civil and military administration of the Imperium on Guilliman's orders, a period forever after known as the Imperial Reformation. To prevent the possibility of large-scale rebellion occurring again, the titanic armies of the Imperial forces were divided. The Space Marine legions were dissolved and split into separate 1,000 Astartes-strong chapters. No longer would the superhuman Space Marines serve as the Imperium's frontline military force. That task would fall to the mortals who had once comprised the Imperial Army. There were far more of them than there were of the surviving Loyalist Space Marines, and more importantly, should they turn renegade, the damage they could do was far less. The newborn Adeptus Astartes would assume the role of planetary assault forces and elite special operations troops. Thus, the Imperial Army, as it had been for centuries, ceased to exist. The link between the Imperial fleet, the Armada Imperialis, and the Imperial Army was formally and bureaucratically severed. Never again would Imperial ground commanders be given direct control over interstellar ships or even their own unit's air support. From the ashes of the Imperial Army were born the separate armed services of the Imperial Navy and the Astra Militarum. The Imperial Guard was reorganized into smaller units known as regiments, an existing formation from the old organization structure of the Imperial Army, and centrally trained political officers known as commissars were universally introduced to watch out for disloyalty and to keep the guardsmen and naval crews properly motivated in defense of the Imperium. The interdependence of the newly formed Astra Militarum, the most numerous of the Emperor's troops, ensured that should a regiment turn against their oaths of fealty, they would not be able to spread their treachery beyond a single world, and should an Imperial Navy fleet mutiny, they would not have the ability to resupply or deploy ground troops. The Imperium had learned a harsh and painful lesson following the dark days of the Horus heresy. This was the birth of the Imperial Guard as it exists in the late 41st millennium. Divided by logistics and separated by the gulfs of space and myriad different planetary cultures, it remains united by a common duty to the God Emperor and mankind. Riddled with inefficiency and bureaucracy, it is often slow to respond and resistant to change, but it continues to function despite the rules laid down by the Adeptus Administratum to limit its power and use by untrustworthy commanders. That no one man can know the extent of the Imperial Guard's total strength at any time is part of this protection and part of its power, as in this way it is truly an army of unlimited size and resources, which can meet the demands of interstellar warfare, but which will only ever answer to the will of the God Emperor himself. The indentured troops of the Imperial Army were assimilated into the command structure of the Space Marine legions and fell under the direct authority of the Primarchs of each Imperial Expeditionary Fleet and his subordinate Space Marine officers. Space Marine transports would arrive at each world and carry the regiments of the Imperial Army, raised there as part of the Imperial Tithe, away to fight on distant battlefields throughout the galaxy. During this bygone era, the Imperial Army and its subset formation, known as the Imperial Fleet or Armada Imperialis, functioned as a single entity, with army commanders exercising overall command of both elements. The regimental formation and overall structure of the ground-based units of the Imperial Army was very similar to that of the present-day Astra Militarum. Many sources from the Great Crusade era concur that the size and organization of an Imperial Army regiment was dictated by what would fit into the interstellar ships available at the time. This meant that most Imperial Army regiments numbered approximately 3,000 troops who would be carried to their destinations by a single dedicated troop transport vessel or one of the many available classes of Imperial cruiser. This approach ensured that an individual regiment was deployed with each warship in an expeditionary fleet. It was doubtless a brutal but necessary equation. The losses of ships in the warp or through enemy action did not result in remnants of a given regiment being left scattered among other vessels and no longer being combat capable. Each regiment maintained its own infantry, armor, and support troops, making it capable of both assaulting and defending varied terrain against most types of opposition. Imperial Army regimental commanders were free to train and equip their regiments as they wished, only being limited by the resources readily available. Keeping warriors from individual worlds together to form the natural bond of brothers in arms was also an important element in creating cohesive fighting formations. In many cases, troops from different worlds could barely understand each other's languages, let alone the nuances of different social mores, customs, tactics, or planetary-specific special equipment. Such difficulties in cross-cultural communication could all degrade a formation's efficiency in combat, so it became the rule in the Imperial Army that each regiment was composed of troops raised from the same world, and they all traveled together on the same transport or warship of the Imperial fleet. All of these realities would eventually lay the groundwork for the tradition of the Imperial Guard, that a regiment is always recruited from a single world and fights together as a whole unit whenever possible. However, over the course of numerous campaigns, regiments were invariably whittled down by casualties, necessitating the recombination of shattered formations into ad hoc groupings. References exist in the Codicium Arcathalore, a fragmentary record of the campaigns of the Pandora sector in the late 30th millennium, to split regimental formations. The Codex makes it clear these were mixed formations made up of heavily mauled Imperial Army regiments recombined to restore their status as effective fighting formations. Likewise, some specialized troops, such as Xeno-cavalry or Ogrins, were apparently always split between larger formations to bolster their efforts. Their specialized capabilities made them unwieldy to operate at the regimental scale, except in certain rare and often excessively emphasized campaigns. The ancient traditions of splitting specialized regiments and recombining remnants are the subject of heated debate between Imperial commanders to this day. Many commanders declare that the reduced efficiency of combined regiments make them barely worth their rations. Infighting and mistrust made the diverse elements function as less than the sum of their parts, and mutinies in such mixed formations were commonplace. Others were interested only in the number of men-at-arms that could be fielded. Their successful integration as effective combat units was of less interest than their overall physical size. The Tactica Imperium presents both viewpoints as equally valid, indicating that no final resolution on the matter was reached, and that some commanders found both strategies useful depending on changing circumstances. The regiments of the Imperial Army were further broken down into battalions. A standard regiment consisted of 3 or more battalions, plus a number of specialized units, which were kept in reserve at the regimental level. These regimental support detachments could be attached to battalions as and when they were needed. The battalion was the smallest formation of the Imperial Army that could act as a combined force, and as such, they sometimes operated independently from their regiment. Battalions were made up of 2 or more companies, plus a variable number of more specialized battalion support detachments. The Imperial Army was used almost exclusively for garrison and pacification roles on both their home and foreign worlds throughout the early stages of the Great Crusade, but by the latter half, they were fighting offensive battles and supplementing the Space Marine legions as they began to be stretched more sparsely across the growing Imperium. The Imperial Army at this time was organized with no particular standardization, and regimental makeups ranged from barbarians wielding power axes to advanced mechanized infantry armed with energy weapons whose designs have now been lost. During this time, the regiments were left almost exclusively to their own recognizance as long as they served faithfully and conformed to the few restrictions placed on them. Due to the sheer variety of worlds and subsequent Imperial Army regiments, a measure of standardization was deemed necessary to allow the army to function as a whole, although the sheer size of the expanding Imperium by this time prevented any true standardization. The treatise that came to be known as the Tactica Imperium was penned and distributed, and a cadre of political officers were created to ensure proper and effective integration and cooperation between regiments. To instill discipline and loyalty in the regiments of the Imperial Army, regiments utilized these newly developed specialists known as discipline masters. These stern taskmasters were primarily responsible for maintaining discipline within the regiment to which they were assigned. They were also responsible for tracking down Imperial Army deserters that repudiated their oaths to the Emperor and shirked their soldierly responsibilities. Discipline masters were known to use hunting eagles to help them track their prey. Their fanatical dedication to the service of the Emperor overrode any feelings of compassion, mercy, or humanity when carrying out the summary executions of those found wanting, for which they employed a ceremonial electro-scythe. The discipline masters served as the ancestors and model for the later officio prefectus and its merciless political officers known as commissars. During this era, it was also common practice for Space Marine primarchs to appoint certain Imperial Army officers to this special office. These veteran warriors ensured that the Imperial Army was unwavering in its duties to its Space Marine overlords. This would later prove disastrous, as those Imperial Army units subordinated to the command of the Space Marine legions that turned traitor uniformly followed their transhuman masters into rebellion, either out of blind fear or unfettered devotion. At the outset of the Horus Heresy, the first rebellious act of traitor Imperial Army units was to kill their discipline masters, while in loyalist regiments, the discipline masters were forced to take extreme measures to maintain order, earning them their fell reputation for steadfastness and calculated brutality later passed on to their commissar descendants. The sheer size of the Imperium, the unpredictable nature of warp travel, and the vast numbers of liberated worlds defeated any attempt to standardize the Imperial Army, and there was wide disparity in the war gear, drill, and discipline of the various regiments. Each of the tithed worlds supplied troops to the Imperial Army as best they could. Those from developed industrial worlds were kitted out with sturdy flak armor and newly minted standard-issue autoguns and laser guns. The autogun was the standard weapon for the Astra Militarum until the opening of the 32nd millennium. Soldiers from primitive worlds were fortunate if they had a pair of boots and a gun. Some worlds supplied troops that were well drilled and organized into squads, companies, and regiments. Others supplied what amounted to little more than loosely ordered mobs or war bands. Despite this, the soldiers of the Imperial Army proved their value in hundreds of campaigns and across thousands of battlefields. In the earliest days of the Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium, the Imperial expeditionary fleets that set out from Terra only carried with them the means to fulfill a portion of their supply needs, and simply took what they needed from the worlds they conquered in their travels. Upon the completion of a successful Imperial compliance action on a world, the expeditionary fleet would move on, leaving the assimilation of the planet into the Imperial fold to fleets of pioneers and Terran colonists. Each world, in time, would become fully capable of supporting itself and contributing to the needs of the growing number of Imperial expeditionary fleets. Such a state of affairs could not continue, for eventually each fleet would exhaust its supplies and be too far from a compliant world capable of resupply. In these times, the resources necessary to fight a campaign were organized by the Lord Commander of each individual expeditionary fleet, a necessity of the times, but one that was wholly unsuited to the growing size and complexity of the Imperium. Ofttimes, a Lord Commander fulfilled multiple roles: war leader, diplomat, exactor, mediator, and logistician. Leaders who could fulfill all of these roles adequately and still have time for the strategic demands of a long campaign were few and far between, and as such, the newly formed Council of Terra recruited those whose minds could function in such a manner, empowering these administrators with the duty of maintaining the Emperor's armies in perpetuity as part of the core logisticae. This was the earliest incarnation of the Departamento Munitorum. The Imperial Army, a cornerstone of humanity's military might during the Great Crusade, embodied the Emperor's vision of unification and strength. While often overshadowed by the legendary Space Marine legions, these mortal soldiers played a crucial role in expanding and maintaining the Imperium's vast territories. Recruitment methods for the Imperial Army varied widely across worlds, reflecting the diverse cultures and societies brought into compliance. Some planets implemented complex selection processes, subjecting potential recruits to grueling physical and mental trials. Others relied on ancient traditions, such as trial by combat or vision quests, to identify worthy candidates. Many worlds saw military service as a means of social advancement, with families eagerly offering their sons and daughters to the Emperor's cause. The training regimens employed by different Imperial Army units were as diverse as their origins. Certain regiments emphasized adaptability, exposing recruits to a wide range of environments and combat scenarios. Others focused on mastering specific terrains or warfare styles, producing specialists in urban combat, Arctic warfare, or jungle operations. Some worlds with particularly harsh climates or dangerous fauna naturally produced hardened soldiers, requiring little additional preparation for the rigors of galactic warfare. Equipment and technology levels among Imperial Army regiments varied dramatically. While some units boasted cutting-edge weaponry and vehicles, others relied on more primitive but no less lethal armaments. This disparity often led to interesting tactical combinations when regiments from different worlds fought together. For example, a technologically advanced unit might provide fire support for tribal warriors skilled in close combat and wilderness survival. The Imperial Army's chain of command was a complex hierarchy, blending military tradition with political necessity. While individual regiments maintained their own command structures, they ultimately answered to Lord Commanders who oversaw multiple regiments and coordinated with Space Marine leaders. These Lord Commanders often hailed from Terra or other core worlds, serving as a link between far-flung regiments and the central Imperial authority. Specialized roles within the Imperial Army went beyond basic infantry and armor divisions. Some regiments boasted unique capabilities, such as telepathic communication corps, Xenos beast handlers, or troops trained in operating salvaged alien technology. These specialized units were highly prized and often shuttled between campaigns where their unique skills were most needed. The logistics of supporting such a vast and diverse force presented enormous challenges. The Imperial Army relied on a network of supply worlds, mobile forge complexes, and mammoth cargo haulers to keep its regiments equipped and battle-ready. Entire planets were sometimes dedicated to producing specific materials or equipment for the army, creating sprawling industrial complexes that stretched across continents. Morale and unit cohesion within the Imperial Army were maintained through various means. Many regiments carried sacred banners or relics from their homeworlds, serving as potent symbols of their heritage and purpose. Others developed complex rituals and traditions, such as blood oaths or victory scarification, to bind soldiers together. Some regiments were accompanied by civilian auxiliaries, artists, chroniclers, and artisans who recorded the unit's deeds and crafted monuments to fallen comrades. The Imperial Army's role in garrison duty on newly compliant worlds often extended beyond mere military presence. Soldiers frequently found themselves acting as ambassadors, peacekeepers, and even teachers, helping to integrate new planets into the Imperial fold. This multifaceted approach sometimes led to the development of unique hybrid cultures on frontier worlds, blending local traditions with imported Imperial customs. Interregimental rivalries were common within the Imperial Army, often stemming from cultural differences or competing martial philosophies. While these rivalries could sometimes lead to tension, wise commanders learned to harness this competitive spirit to drive their troops to greater achievements. Annual martial contests between regiments became a popular tradition, fostering both skill improvement and a sense of army-wide camaraderie. The Imperial Army's fleet assets, though often overshadowed by the might of the Space Marine Legion's warships, played a crucial role in countless campaigns. Specialized assault landers, atmospheric fighters, and void-capable gunships provided vital support to ground operations. Some regiments even maintained their own flotillas of system defense ships, adding another layer of flexibility to their capabilities. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Imperial Army began to develop its own distinct martial culture, separate from but complementary to that of the Space Marines. Veterans of multiple campaigns became living legends, their exploits celebrated in song and story across the Imperium. These heroes served as powerful recruitment tools and sources of inspiration for new generations of soldiers. The psychological impact of the Imperial Army on newly discovered human worlds cannot be overstated. For isolated colonies that had endured millennia of hardship and Xenos predation, the arrival of vast armies of fellow humans was often seen as nothing short of miraculous. This effect was carefully cultivated by Imperial propaganda, positioning the army as the vanguard of a new golden age for humanity. Within the ranks of the Imperial Army, a complex system of honors and decorations evolved, reflecting the diverse cultures of its constituent regiments. Some units favored intricate tattoos or scarification to mark acts of valor, while others bestowed ornate medals or ceremonial weapons. Particularly distinguished soldiers might receive cybernetic enhancements or rare gene therapies, blurring the line between mortal trooper and post-human warrior. Specialized scout units played a crucial role in the Imperial Army's operations, often deploying years ahead of the main invasion forces. These advanced teams gathered intelligence, established covert networks, and sometimes even manipulated planetary politics to pave the way for a smoother compliance action. Many of these scouts were recruited from feral worlds, prizing their natural survival instincts and adaptability. The Imperial Army's artillery corps developed a fearsome reputation during the Great Crusade. Enormous mobile batteries could reduce entire cityscapes to rubble, while more precise weapons targeted enemy commanders or severed supply lines with surgical accuracy. Some artillery regiments specialized in exotic ammunition, ranging from mutagenic gas shells to miniaturized vortex warheads. Armored divisions within the Imperial Army showcased an astounding variety of war machines. While the iconic Lehman Russ battle tank formed the backbone of many armored regiments, countless variants and local designs saw action across the galaxy. Some worlds produced colossal landships that dwarfed even Titans, while others favored swarms of lightning-fast skimmers or burrowing siege engines. The role of abhumans in the Imperial Army was a subject of ongoing debate. While some commanders viewed ratlings, ogrins, and other stable mutant strains as valuable assets, others harbored deep-seated prejudices against these divergent humans. This tension sometimes led to the creation of all abhuman regiments, either as a form of segregation or to leverage their unique abilities more effectively. Psychological warfare units became an integral part of many Imperial Army formations. These specialists employed a range of tactics, from broadcasting mind-shredding frequencies to deploying hallucinogenic agents that could break an enemy's will to fight. Some regiments even included fear squads, soldiers modified or trained to emanate a palpable aura of terror on the battlefield. The Imperial Army's medical corps faced unique challenges in treating the myriad injuries and ailments encountered during the Great Crusade. Xenobiologists worked alongside traditional chirurgeons, developing new treatments for alien poisons and warp-tainted wounds. Mobile field hospitals grew to the size of small cities, equipped with stasis chambers and rejuvenate tanks to preserve grievously wounded soldiers until proper care could be administered. Cultural exchange between Imperial Army regiments led to the emergence of a distinct soldier's dialect, a pidgin language incorporating elements from hundreds of worlds. This unofficial lingua franca facilitated communication between diverse units and often proved useful when interacting with newly discovered human colonies. Some Imperial Army regiments specialized in rapid reaction deployments, priding themselves on their ability to transition from void transit to planetfall combat in a matter of hours. These units often utilized experimental personal teleportation devices or drop pods, allowing them to insert directly into the heart of enemy territories. The concept of planet breaker regiments emerged late in the Great Crusade. These formations specialized in fighting on death worlds or planets with extreme environmental conditions. Equipped with heavily modified power armor and life support systems, these troopers could battle in environments that would quickly kill unprotected humans. Void-adapted regiments represented a unique subset of the Imperial Army, trained and equipped to fight in the zero-gravity environments of space hulks, asteroid fields, and orbital installations. These soldiers often underwent extensive augmentation to better survive in airless environments, sometimes barely recognizable as human. The Imperial Army's Engineers Corps played a vital role in both combat operations and post-compliance reconstruction efforts. These units could rapidly establish fortifications, repair damaged infrastructure, or even terraform small moons to serve as forward operating bases. Some engineer regiments specialized in countering Xenos biotech or adapting captured alien structures for human use. Regimental mascots and totemic creatures were common among Imperial Army units, ranging from Terran animals to exotic Xenos beasts. These mascots served as powerful symbols of unit identity and were often believed to bring luck or protection in battle. Some regiments even employed empathic aliens or warp-touched creatures as living augurs to warn of impending danger. The Imperial Army's attitude towards captured enemy combatants varied widely between regiments and campaigns. Some units were known for their strict adherence to codes of honorable warfare, while others gained notoriety for their brutal treatment of prisoners. Certain specialized regiments focused on interrogation and re-education of captured foes, turning them into valuable intelligence assets or even loyal Imperial citizens. Ceremonial units within the Imperial Army served as visible reminders of humanity's martial pride and imperial authority. These soldiers, often drawn from noble families or veteran ranks, performed elaborate drills and parades on compliant worlds. While sometimes dismissed as mere showpieces, many of these units proved themselves to be elite shock troops when pressed into actual combat. The development of battlefield prognostication became an area of intense study within some Imperial Army formations. Utilizing a combination of advanced data analysis, limited precognitive psychers, and esoteric divination techniques, these units attempted to predict enemy movements and optimal strategies. The reliability of these predictions was hotly debated, but some commanders swore by their effectiveness. Specialized Imperial Army units were tasked with countering the threat of enemy psychers and warp-based attacks. These troops utilized a range of anti-psychic technologies, from null field generators to weapons that could disrupt warp energies. Some regiments even included blunt psychers, individuals with the ability to dampen or negate enemy psychic powers. The concept of living weapons was explored by certain radical elements within the Imperial Army. These controversial programs involved the creation of symbiotic organisms that could bond with human hosts, granting them enhanced abilities at the cost of their humanity. While officially discouraged, rumors persisted of entire regiments composed of these bio-augmented super soldiers. Naval infantry regiments formed a crucial link between the Imperial Army's void assets and planetary operations. These specialized troops were experts in ship-to-ship boarding actions, zero-gravity combat, and rapid planetfall insertions. Many naval infantry units developed a distinct subculture, viewing themselves as elite warriors straddling the line between void sailors and ground pounders. The Imperial Army's approach to urban warfare evolved rapidly during the Great Crusade, as they encountered everything from primitive hab blocks to sprawling hive cities and Xenos arcologies. Specialized units emerged, trained in the art of clearing massive structures room by room or fighting through the industrial underbellies of manufactory worlds. Some regiments even included teams of architect warriors who could analyze and exploit the structural weaknesses of enemy-held buildings. Embedded within many Imperial Army regiments were specialized memoric units, tasked with preserving the collective experiences and tactical knowledge of their comrades. These soldiers underwent extensive hypno-conditioning and mnemonic augmentation, allowing them to absorb and catalog vast amounts of information. In the event of catastrophic casualties, these living archives could rapidly train replacement troops, ensuring that hard-won combat experience was never truly lost. The concept of adaptive camouflage saw significant development among certain Imperial Army formations. Beyond simple color-changing fabrics, some regiments employed reactive armor that could mimic the texture and even the scent of their surroundings. More exotic variants incorporated psychic elements, subtly influencing the minds of observers to render soldiers nearly invisible. Xenotech integration teams became a controversial but increasingly common sight within the Imperial Army. These units specialized in rapidly analyzing and adapting alien technology for human use on the battlefield. While purists decried this practice as dangerous and potentially corrupting, pragmatic commanders argued that it provided a crucial tactical edge in confronting unknown threats. The emergence of chrono-guerrilla tactics marked a significant evolution in Imperial Army doctrine. Utilizing unstable warp tech and esoteric chronometric devices, these specialized units could create localized time distortions on the battlefield. This allowed for complex maneuvers that seemed to defy conventional physics, though the long-term effects on the soldiers themselves remained a subject of grim speculation. Void-born regiments represented a unique subset of the Imperial Army, comprised of soldiers raised entirely on massive generation ships or sprawling space stations. These troops often possessed natural adaptations to low-gravity environments and an intuitive understanding of void combat. However, they sometimes struggled with the psychological impact of planetary deployments, finding open skies and untamed wildernesses deeply unsettling. The Imperial Army's approach to asymmetric warfare underwent significant refinement during the latter stages of the Great Crusade. Specialized insurgency architect units were developed, capable of rapidly destabilizing enemy-held worlds through a combination of sabotage, propaganda, and carefully orchestrated uprisings. These shadow wars often paved the way for more overt military action, or in some cases, achieved compliance without the need for large-scale invasions. Unique among Imperial Army formations were the so-called blank regiments, units comprised entirely of psychic nulls. These soldiers, utterly devoid of warp presence, proved invaluable in campaigns against psychically active Xeno species or warp-tainted foes. However, their unsettling aura made cooperation with standard human troops challenging, often necessitating their deployment as independent strike forces. The concept of mimetic warfare gained traction among certain Imperial Army strategists. Specialized units were trained to craft and disseminate ideas that could rapidly spread through enemy populations, undermining morale or even triggering mass defections. This approach proved particularly effective against human separatist movements, though its use against xenospecies yielded unpredictable and sometimes catastrophic results. Extreme environment specialists became highly prized assets within the Imperial Army. These regiments underwent extensive genetic modification and cybernetic augmentation to operate in the most hostile conditions imaginable. From troops capable of fighting in the crushing pressures of gas giant atmospheres to soldiers who could endure the molecular shredding effects of certain nebulae, these units expanded the theater of war to realms once thought impossible. The development of synaptic shock weapons represented a dark evolution in the Imperial Army's arsenal. These devices targeted the neural pathways of enemy combatants, inducing paralyzing fear, unbearable pain, or even complete cognitive shutdown. While devastatingly effective, the use of such weapons remained contentious, with some arguing that they crossed ethical lines even in a galaxy at war. Specialized Void Whisperer units emerged as a crucial component of the Imperial Army's naval operations. These individuals possessed an uncanny ability to predict warp currents and navigate the treacherous realms between real space and the immaterium. While not psychers in the traditional sense, their talents allowed for more precise and rapid void travel, giving Imperial fleets a significant strategic advantage. The concept of living fortifications saw limited but noteworthy implementation among certain Imperial Army regiments. Utilizing a combination of genetically engineered organisms and adaptive materials, these units could rapidly establish defensive positions that would grow and evolve in response to enemy attacks. While effective, the unpredictable nature of these semi-sentient structures made them a controversial choice among more conservative commanders. Hololithic warfare specialists represented the cutting edge of Imperial Army tactical doctrine. These soldiers were equipped with advanced projection technology that allowed them to create convincing illusions on the battlefield, from phantom reinforcements to illusory terrain features. When combined with traditional military assets, these deception tactics could completely overwhelm enemy strategic planning. The emergence of empathic reconnaissance units marked a significant advancement in Imperial Army intelligence gathering. These specialized troops underwent extensive conditioning to heighten their emotional sensitivity, allowing them to intuitively gauge the morale and intentions of both enemy combatants and civilian populations. While not as precise as traditional psychic scrying, this approach proved far less detectable and thus invaluable for covert operations. Xenos hybrid regiments, while officially forbidden, were rumored to exist within the shadowy fringes of the Imperial Army. These units allegedly incorporated the genetic traits of compatible alien species, creating soldiers with capabilities far beyond standard humans. Whether these regiments were sanctioned experiments or rogue elements remains a topic of heated debate among Imperial historians. The development of adamantic weaponry represented a terrifying new frontier in the Imperial Army's arsenal. These devices manipulated the fundamental forces binding matter together, allowing for the controlled dissolution of enemy troops and war machines. The unpredictable nature of these weapons, combined with their potential for collateral damage, limited their deployment to only the most desperate or strategically vital engagements. Specialized void current riders emerged as an elite subset of Imperial Army naval forces. These individuals underwent extensive augmentation and training to survive direct exposure to the warp, allowing them to perform maintenance and combat operations on the exterior of vessels during warp transit. Their ability to effect repairs and repel boarders while ships were in flight proved invaluable during extended campaigns. The concept of recursive troops gained traction among certain Imperial Army geneticists. These soldiers were engineered with enhanced cellular regeneration and the ability to rapidly grow replacement organs. In theory, a single trooper could serve as the nucleus for an entire regiment, with new soldiers cultivated from their genetic material as needed. Ethical concerns and the unpredictable results of this process limited its widespread adoption. Quantum entangled communication specialists represented the pinnacle of Imperial Army Signal Corps technology. These troops utilized paired particles to transmit information instantaneously across vast distances, bypassing the limitations of traditional Vox networks and the vagaries of astropathic communication. The scarcity of the materials required for this technology restricted its use to only the most critical operations. The development of mimetic inoculation protocols became a priority for many Imperial Army units facing chaos-tainted or psychically active foes. These mental conditioning techniques aimed to fortify soldiers against corrupting influences and reality-warping psychic assaults. While effective, the process often left troops with a degree of emotional detachment, leading some to question the long-term psychological impact of such measures.